The man standing in the shadows wasn't just a customer. He was a man who could buy the entire city block with a signature. But Sarah, a waitress drowning in debt, didn't know that. All she saw was a terrified, disabled boy struggling to hold a spoon while his father stepped away, disregarding the strict restaurant policy, and her abusive manager screaming in her earpiece. Sarah made a choice that would cost her everything. She sat down and fed the boy herself. She didn't know the father was watching from the doorway, tears in his eyes. She didn't know that this single spoonful of soup was about to trigger a chain of events that would destroy her life, and then rebuild it into something unimaginable. The rain in Seattle didn't just fall. It hammered against the pavement like it had a personal vendetta against anyone trying to make a living. Inside the Gilded Lily, one of the city's most pretentious French bistros, the atmosphere was dry, warm, and suffocatingly tense. Sarah Jenkins adjusted the collar of her stiff white uniform, wincing as the cheap fabric rubbed against the sunburn on her neck. She had been on her feet for 10 hours. Her ankles were swollen, throbbing in rhythm with the ambient jazz music floating through the dining room. Every time she put weight on her left heel, a sharp bolt of pain shot up her calf, a reminder of the double shift she'd been pulling for 3 months straight. "Table 4 is waiting, Sarah. Do you need a written invitation?" The voice was a low, venomous hiss. Sarah didn't have to turn around to know it was Rick, the floor manager. Rick was a man who wore suits that were too tight and possessed a soul that was 2 sizes too small. He managed the restaurant like a prison warden, and Sarah was his favorite inmate to torture. "I'm going, Rick," Sarah whispered, grabbing a pitcher of water. "Smile, Jenkins," Rick sneered, checking his reflection in the polished brass railing. "You look like a funeral procession. People come here to forget their misery, not look at yours." Sarah forced a smile onto her face. It felt brittle, like it might crack and bleed. She couldn't lose this job. The eviction notice sitting on her kitchen counter was bright pink, a cheerful color for a document that said she had 3 days to come up with $2, $400, or be thrown onto the street. Her mother's dialysis treatments had eaten every cent of her savings, and her credit cards were maxed out. She navigated the crowded floor, dodging waiters carrying trays of escargot and foie gras. The patrons of the Gilded Lily were the elite of the Pacific Northwest: tech CEOs, old money heiresses, and politicians. They looked through Sarah as if she were made of glass. The bell above the heavy oak door chimed, signaling a new arrival. Usually, the hostess, a terrifyingly beautiful woman named Chloe, would intercept guests immediately. But Chloe was currently flirting with a minor celebrity at the bar. The door swung open, bringing a gust of cold, wet wind into the warm room. Standing there was a man who looked like he had been dragged through a hurricane. His dark trench coat was soaked, water dripping onto the pristine marble floor. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his eyes, steel gray and exhausted, scanned the room with a mixture of desperation and defensiveness. But it was who he was holding that caught Sarah's attention. Clinging to the man's hand was a boy, perhaps 10 or 11 years old. He was seated in a specialized, lightweight wheelchair that looked battered. The boy's limbs were curled inward, his head lolling slightly to the side. He was making a low, keening sound, rocking back and forth. He was soaked, too, shivering violently. The dining room went silent. Forks paused halfway to mouths. In a place where image was everything, this wet, disheveled pair was a smudge on a perfect painting. Rick materialized out of thin air, marching toward the door with the stride of a bouncer. Sarah froze, clutching her water pitcher, watching the collision course. "Sir," Rick said, his voice loud enough to carry, "the kitchen is closing. We cannot seat you." The man looked at his watch. It was a Patek Philippe, though the face was cracked. "It's 8:30. Your sign says you're open until 10. His voice was raspy, like he hadn't spoken in days. "We just need soup. Something warm, please. We are fully booked," Rick lied, crossing his arms. He blocked the path into the dining room. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You're dripping water everywhere. It's a safety hazard." The boy in the chair let out a loud, sudden cry. He flailed his arm, hitting his father's leg. "Shh, Leo, it's okay," the man whispered, bending down to stroke the boy's wet hair. He looked up at Rick, his eyes hardening. "My son is hungry. We've been stuck in traffic for 3 hours because of the storm. We aren't leaving until he eats." Rick's face turned a shade of purple. He hated defiance. "Sir, if you don't leave, I'm calling security." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She saw the trimmer in the man's hands. She saw the blue tint on the boy's lips. This wasn't a drunk causing a scene. This was a father at the end of his rope. Before she could stop herself, Sarah stepped forward. "I have a table, Rick," she said. Rick spun around, his eyes bulging. "Excuse me?" "Table 9. In the corner," Sarah said quickly, her voice shaking but clear. "It's open. I can take them." "I'll clean up the water." Rick stared at her, his jaw working. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and mints. "You put them in the back," he hissed, so only she could hear. "If that kid makes a scene, it's coming out of your tips." "And Jenkins? You're on thin ice." Sarah nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She turned to the man and the boy with a genuine, soft smile. "Right this way, sir. Let's get you dried off." The man looked at her, stunned. For a second, the steel in his eyes melted, replaced by a profound, crushing relief. "Thank you," he breathed. She led them to a secluded booth in the back, away from the prying eyes of the other diners. As the man helped maneuver the wheelchair, Sarah grabbed extra napkins and quickly dried the table. "I'm Sarah," she said gently. "I'll be taking care of you tonight." "Julian," the man said, taking off his wet coat. He didn't offer a last name. He draped his coat over the boy, Leo, who was still shivering. "We just need the potato leek soup. 2 bowls. And bread, soft bread." "Coming right up," Sarah said. She rushed to the kitchen. The chef, a temperamental man named Pierre, grumbled about the order but ladled the soup. Sarah didn't wait for him to garnish it perfectly. She grabbed the tray and ran. When she returned to the table, the situation had changed. Julian was standing up, his phone pressed to his ear. His face was pale. "What do you mean the server crashed?" Julian was saying, his voice tight with panic. "No, do not reboot it yet. I'm 20 minutes away. Listen to me, if that data is lost, the merger is dead. I have to step out to take this. The signal is garbage in here." He looked at Leo, then at Sarah, torn. "Sir, go," Sarah said instinctively. "The signal is better just outside the front door under the awning. I'll watch him." Julian hesitated. He looked at his son, who was staring at the steaming bowl of soup with wide, hungry eyes. "I'll be 2 minutes. Just keep an eye on him." "I promise," Sarah said. Julian rushed toward the front door, the bell chiming again as he vanished into the rainy night to save his business. Sarah turned back to the table. It was just her and Leo now. The boy was trying to reach the spoon. His hands were spastic, his fingers curled tight. He managed to bat at the spoon, knocking it onto the floor with a loud clatter. He let out a frustrated wail, his face scrunching up. He looked at the soup, then at his useless hands, and then at Sarah. The look in his eyes broke her heart. It was a look of pure, intelligent frustration trapped inside a body that wouldn't cooperate. He tried to lower his face to the bowl, like a dog, desperate to eat. "No, sweetie, don't do that," Sarah whispered. She looked around. Rick was at the front podium, berating the hostess. The other diners were busy with their wine. "Sarah, new rules. Servers do not sit with guests. Servers do not touch the guests. Maintain professional distance." Breaking these rules was grounds for immediate termination. Leo let out another cry, louder this time. Tears were mixing with the rainwater on his cheeks. Sarah didn't think about the eviction notice. She didn't think about the $2. $400. She thought about her own brother, who had died when they were kids, and how her mother used to spoon-feed him soup when he was sick. She grabbed a clean spoon from the neighboring table. She pulled out the chair opposite Leo and sat down. The restaurant faded into the background. For Sarah, the universe narrowed down to the steaming bowl of potato leek soup and the trembling boy in front of her. "It's okay, Leo," she said softly, her voice a soothing hum amidst the clatter of silverware and low conversation around them. "I've got you. Let's try this together." Leo looked at her, his head lolling to the right. His eyes were a startling shade of green, vivid and intelligent. He stopped whimpering, sensing the shift in her demeanor. She wasn't pitying him. She was helping him. There was a difference, and Leo, despite his challenges, knew it intimately. Sarah dipped the spoon into the creamy soup. She blew on it gently, checking the steam. "Open up," she whispered, mimicking the tone she used to use with her little cousins. Leo opened his mouth. Sarah guided the spoon in, careful not to scrape his teeth. He swallowed eagerly, some of the broth escaping the corner of his mouth. Without hesitation, Sarah took her own pristine white serving napkin, the one she was supposed to keep folded over her arm at all times, and gently dabbed his chin. "Good job!" she smiled. "Is it good?" "Pierre is a grump, but he makes good soup." Leo made a sound that sounded vaguely like a hum of approval. He tapped the table with his knuckles, a gesture Sarah interpreted as more. "Okay, coming in for a landing," she joked quietly, loading the spoon again. She fed him rhythmically, matching his pace. She ignored the buzzing of the restaurant. She ignored the fact that Table 5 was glaring at her because their wine glasses were empty. She was locked in a moment of pure humanity. She didn't notice the front door opening. She didn't notice Julian standing in the entryway, his phone hanging limp in his hand. The crisis on the call had been resolved, or maybe he had just hung up. It didn't matter. Julian Thorne, the billionaire CEO of Thorne Dynamics, a man known for his ruthless negotiation tactics and icy demeanor, stood frozen. He had expected to come back to a disaster. He had expected Leo to be wailing, covered in soup, with the staff looking on in disgust. It was what usually happened. Nannies quit. Waiters stared. The world usually turned its back on Leo because he was difficult. But here was this waitress, this young woman with tired eyes and fraying shoes, sitting down. She was talking to Leo like he was a person, not a problem. Julian watched as Sarah broke off a piece of soft bread, dipped it in the broth, and offered it to his son. He saw Leo smile, a real, crooked, beautiful smile that Julian hadn't seen in months, not since his wife Leo's mother passed away a year ago. A lump formed in Julian's throat, so large it felt like he was choking. He stayed in the shadows of the foyer, hidden by a large potted fern, unable to move. He wanted to capture this moment, to memorize the kindness of a stranger. But the moment was about to be shattered. "Jenkins!" The roar tore through the restaurant like a gunshot. Sarah jumped, the spoon clattering against the bowl. Leo flinched violently, letting out a terrified shriek. Rick was marching across the dining room floor, his face a mask of red-hot fury. He didn't care about the customers anymore. He saw a server sitting down. On the job. "What do you think you are doing?" Rick bellowed, reaching the table. Sarah scrambled to stand up, her face draining of color. "Rick, he needed help and I don't pay you to babysit." Rick spat, pointing a shaking finger at her face. "I pay you to serve tables. Look at table 5. Look at table 7. They are waiting. And you are sitting here playing nursemaid to a... He gestured vaguely and disgustingly at Leo. "Don't talk about him like that," Sarah said, a sudden surge of anger overriding her fear. "He couldn't hold the spoon. His father had to step out. I was just helping." "You are fired," Rick said, his voice dropping to a cold final tone. The words hung in the air. "Rick, please." Sarah's voice cracked. The reality of the eviction notice came crashing back. "I need this job. I won't do it again, please." "Get your things," Rick said, crossing his arms, "and get out, now, before I call the police for trespassing." Leo began to cry, a loud, heartbroken sound. He knew, in his own way, that he was the cause of this anger. He started hitting his own head with his wrist, a self-soothing tic that looked violent to outsiders. "Stop it!" Rick yelled at the boy. "Shut that kid up!" "Hey!" The voice came from the front of the room. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that instantly silenced the room. It was a voice accustomed to boardrooms and command centers. Julian stepped out of the shadows. He walked toward the table, not with the hurried desperation of a wet father anymore, but with the predatory grace of a tiger. He didn't look at Sarah. He looked straight at Rick. "Is there a problem here?" Julian asked calmly. Rick, still high on his power trip, sneered at Julian. He saw the predator take a wet coat, the messy hair. He didn't see the billionaire. He saw a nuisance. Yes, there is a problem, Rick said, puffing out his chest. Your child is disrupting my customers, and my waitress decided to stop working to play mommy. She's been fired, and you need to pay your bill and leave. Immediately. Julian looked at Sarah. He saw the tears welling in her eyes, the way her hands were shaking. He looked at Leo, who was reaching out for Sarah, not his father. Julian reached into his wet trench coat pocket. He didn't pull out a wallet. He pulled out a black card made of anodized titanium. He held it up between two fingers. I'm not paying the bill, Julian said softly. Rick laughed, a dry barking sound. Oh, you're not? Then I'm calling the cops. Theft of services. I'm not paying the bill, Julian repeated, stepping closer, his height towering over the manager. Because I'm buying the building, Rick blinked. What? I'm buying the building, Julian said, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. And the first thing I'm going to do as the owner is fire you. The restaurant went dead silent. Even the jazz music seemed to stop. Sarah looked from Rick to Julian, her mouth slightly open. Was this a joke? Was this man crazy? Julian turned to Sarah. The intensity in his eyes frightened her. What is your full name? He asked. Sarah Jenkins, she stammered. Sarah Jenkins, Julian repeated, as if memorizing it. He turned back to Rick. Who is the owner of the Gilded Lily? It's part of the Vantage Group, isn't it? Marcus Vantage? Rick's arrogance faltered. Yes. Mr. Vantage, how do you... Julian pulled out his phone again. He dialed a number and put it on speaker. Julian, is that you? A voice answered instantly. It was a voice Sarah recognized from TV. It was Marcus Vantage, the local restaurant tycoon. Marcus, Julian said, his eyes never leaving Rick's face. I'm at your 4th Avenue location. I want to buy it. Tonight. Right now. Julian, you're joking. Marcus laughed nervously. That's my flagship. Name your price, Marcus. Double market value. But the deal has a condition. The current manager, a man named Rick, has to be escorted off the premises within 5 minutes, or the deal is off. There was a silence on the phone. Then, Rick? Is Rick there? Rick was trembling now. Mr. Vantage, this guy is... Shut up, Rick. Marcus snapped through the phone. Julian, are you serious? Deadly. Done. Hand the phone to Rick. Julian held the phone out to Rick. Rick took it with shaking hands. He listened for 10 seconds, his face turning from purple to a ghostly white. He dropped the phone. It clattered on the floor. Rick looked at Sarah, then at Julian. He didn't say a word. He turned around, stripped off his name tag, threw it on the nearest table, and walked out the front door into the rain. The dining room erupted into whispers. Sarah stood there, her heart pounding so hard she thought she might faint. She looked at Julian. Did you just buy a restaurant to save my job? She whispered. Julian looked at her, his expression unreadable. He picked up his phone. No, he said coldly. Sarah blinked, confused. What? I didn't do it to save your job, Julian said, putting his phone away. He walked over to Leo and began wiping the soup from the boy's face, his demeanor suddenly shifting back to the exhausted father. I did it to teach him a lesson. But you... He stood up and looked Sarah in the eye. You're fired, Sarah. The words, you're fired, hung in the air like smoke in a breathless room. Sarah felt her knees buckle. The adrenaline that had fueled her defense of the boy evaporated, leaving her cold, hollow, and trembling. She stared at Julian Thorne, this man who had just spent millions of dollars on a whim. This man she had thought, for a fleeting, foolish second, was a hero. Excuse me? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain still pounding against the glass. Julian was looking at her with that intense, analytical gaze, the same look he used to dismantle rival companies. He opened his mouth to speak, to finish his sentence. He had intended to say, You're fired from this dead-end job because I'm hiring you for something better. I need someone who sees my son, not his wheelchair. But he never got the chance. At that exact moment, the adrenaline crash hit Leo. The stress of the shouting, the loud noises, and the sudden shift in atmosphere triggered a sensory overload. Leo let out a piercing, high-pitched scream and arched his back, his limbs stiffening in a painful spasm. "Leo!" Julian shouted, his attention instantly snapping away from Sarah. He dropped to his knees, his expensive suit trousers soaking up the puddle of water on the floor. "Leo, breathe! Look at me, buddy, breathe!" Sarah's instinct was to rush forward, to help. She took a step, her hand reaching out. But then she stopped. "You're fired." The words echoed in her mind. Why should she help? This man had just destroyed her livelihood. He had toyed with Rick, and now he was toying with her. To people like Julian Thorne, she wasn't a person. She was an NPC in his life simulation. He had fired her for sport. A wave of nausea and humiliation crashed over her. She looked at the other diners, the wealthy elites whispering behind their hands, watching the show. She felt dirty, poor, and small. "Fine," Sarah said, her voice shaking with a mixture of grief and rage. Julian was busy holding Leo's head, trying to calm him. He didn't hear her. "I said fine," Sarah yelled, tearing off her apron. Julian looked up, startled, his eyes wide. He looked like he wanted to say something, his hand reaching out toward her. "Wait, Sarah, no, listen." "No, you listen," Sarah snapped, throwing the stained white apron onto the floor. "You rich people are all the same. You think because you have a black card you can treat people like trash. I helped your son because I'm a human being. Not because I wanted your pity, and definitely not to be part of some power trip." "Sarah, please, you don't understand," Julian pleaded, struggling to hold the flailing boy. "Just wait 1 second." "I don't have a second," Sarah cried, tears finally spilling over. "I have a sick mother. I have rent due in 2 days. And thanks to you, I have nothing. Absolutely nothing." She spun on her heel, ignoring the gasps of the customers. She grabbed her purse from the server station. "Sarah!" Julian shouted after her, his voice desperate. But Sarah was already pushing through the heavy oak doors. She burst out into the night, the freezing Seattle rain instantly soaking her uniform. She didn't look back. She didn't see Julian trying to stand up, only to be pulled back down by his terrified son. She didn't see the look of devastation on the billionaire's face as he realized he had just crushed the only person who had shown his son kindness. She just ran. She ran until her lungs burned. She ran until the lights of the Gilded Lily were just a blur in the distance. She ran to the bus stop, collapsed onto the metal bench, and buried her face in her hands, sobbing as the rain mixed with her tears. She had stood up for what was right, and it had cost her everything. The apartment complex in the south end of the city smelled of boiled cabbage and mildew. It was a place where people lived not because they wanted to, but because they had nowhere else to go. Sarah fumbled with her keys, her hands numb from the cold. She unlocked the peeling door of apartment 4B and stepped inside. "Sarah, is that you?" The voice coming from the bedroom was weak, punctuated by a wet, rattling cough. Sarah wiped her face aggressively, forcing a cheerful mask onto her features. She couldn't let her mom know. Not tonight. Martha Jenkins had enough to worry about. "Hi, Mom," Sarah called out, walking into the small, dim bedroom. Martha was propped up on pillows, her skin gray and papery. The dialysis machine in the corner hummed, a constant, expensive reminder of their fragility. "You're home early," Martha wheezed, smiling faintly. "Slow night?" "Yeah," Sarah lied, her heart twisting. "Super slow. Rick let me cut out early." She sat on the edge of the bed and took her mother's hand. It felt frail, like bird bones. Did you get the tips?" Martha asked, her eyes darting toward the pile of bills on the nightstand. "The pharmacy called. They won't refill the prescription without the copay." Sarah felt a cold stone settle in her stomach. She had walked out without cashing out her tips. She had nothing. I have it handled, Mom," Sarah whispered, kissing her mother's forehead. "Don't worry. I'll pick up the meds tomorrow morning." "You're a good girl, Sarah," Martha sighed, closing her eyes. "I'm so sorry. I'm such a burden." "Don't you ever say that," Sarah said fiercely. "You're my mom. We're a team." She waited until her mother's breathing evened out into sleep. Then, Sarah walked into the tiny kitchen and collapsed onto the linoleum floor. She pulled the pink eviction notice off the counter and stared at it. Past due. $2, 400. Notice to vacate. 48 hours. She had 48 hours to find a miracle. The next 2 days were a blur of humiliation. Sarah hit the pavement at 6 a.m. She walked into every diner, cafe, and restaurant within a 10-mile radius. She had a resume, but she also had a problem. Rick. Word travels fast in the industry. When she applied at the Blue Anchor, the manager looked at her application and sneered. Sarah Jenkins? From the Gilded Lily? Yes, Sarah said hopefully. I got a text about you, the manager said, tossing her resume in the trash. Rick said you caused a scene, harassed a VIP customer, and walked out mid-shift. We don't hire drama queens. That's not what happened, Sarah protested. Rick is a liar. Rick is a manager with 20 years of experience. You're a waitress. Who am I going to believe? Get out. Door after door slammed in her face. The blacklist was real, and Rick, vindictive even in his own defeat, must have sent out a warning to his network before he was escorted off the premises. By the evening of the second day, Sarah was desperate. She went to a pawn shop on 3rd Street. She pulled a small velvet box out of her pocket. Inside was a gold locket, the only thing her father had left her before he died. It was her most prized possession. How much? She asked the pawnbroker, her voice trembling. The man examined it with a loupe, uninterested. Gold's thin. Scratch on the back. $70. 70? It's an antique. It's worth at least 300. 70. Take it or leave it. Sarah looked at the locket one last time. She thought of her mom's medication. I'll take it, she whispered. She left the shop with $70. It was enough for the copay on the medicine and a loaf of bread. It was not enough for the rent. She walked home in the rain, the same relentless Seattle rain that had started this whole nightmare. She felt like the sky was weeping for her. When she reached her apartment building, she saw it. A man in a beige uniform was stapling a piece of paper to her door. Sarah broke into a run. No! Wait! The sheriff's deputy turned around. He looked sympathetic but firm. Sarah Jenkins? Please, Sarah panted, reaching the landing. I just need a few more days. My mom is sick. She can't be moved. I'm sorry, miss, the deputy said. The landlord filed the order this morning. You have until tomorrow at noon to vacate the premises. If you're not out, we have to remove your belongings to the curb. Tomorrow at noon? Sarah screamed. Where are we supposed to go? There's a shelter on First Avenue, the deputy said, looking away. Good luck. He walked past her, leaving her staring at the final eviction order. Sarah unlocked the door and walked inside. The apartment was dark. Her mother was coughing in the other room. Sarah slid down the door, hugging her knees to her chest. She had failed. She had tried to be a good person, tried to work hard, tried to do everything right. And she had failed. She closed her eyes, wishing she could just disappear. Knock, knock, knock. Sarah jumped. Had the deputy come back? She stood up, wiping her eyes, and opened the door a crack. It wasn't the deputy. Standing in the hallway was a man in a sharp black suit. He was holding a large umbrella and a briefcase. He looked like a Secret Service agent. Sarah Jenkins? The man asked. What now? Sarah snapped, her patience gone. Are you here to take my kidney? Because that's all I have left. The man didn't smile. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with red wax. My name is Arthur. I represent the Thorne estate. Sarah froze. Thorne, the man from the restaurant. Go away, Sarah hissed, trying to slam the door. I don't want to hear it. He fired me. He ruined my life. Tell him to go to hell. Arthur stuck his expensive leather shoe in the doorframe, blocking it. Ms. Jenkins, please, Arthur said, his voice calm. Mr. Thorne has been trying to find you for 48 hours. You didn't leave a contact number on your file. I don't care, Sarah said, pushing against the door. He doesn't want to hurt you, Arthur said. He knows about the eviction. Sarah stopped pushing. Her blood ran cold. How? How does he know that? Mr. Thorne knows everything, Arthur said simply. He also knows about your mother, Martha, and her kidney condition. Sarah backed away, terrified. Who are you people? Arthur stepped into the apartment, closing the umbrella. He held out the envelope. He wants to make you a job offer, Sarah. A real one. One that pays considerably more than waitressing. Sarah stared at the envelope. I don't believe you. It's a trick. It's not a trick, Arthur said. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a check. He held it up. It was a cashier's check, made out to Sarah Jenkins. The amount was $50,000. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. What? What is this? This is an advance, Arthur said, just for agreeing to meet with him. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., Thorn Tower. Sarah looked at the check. It was enough to pay the rent for 2 years. It was enough for a transplant list deposit. It was freedom. Why? Sarah whispered. Why would he do this? Arthur's expression softened, just a fraction. Because, Arthur said, Leo hasn't eaten since you left. Thorn Tower pierced the Seattle skyline like a shard of black glass. It was a fortress of wealth and power, the kind of place Sarah had only ever seen on postcards. At 8:55 a.m., she stood in the private elevator, her hands clasping the strap of her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. She was wearing her best outfit, a gray skirt suit she'd bought at a thrift store for job interviews, but in the mirrored walls of the elevator, she still felt like the waitress from the Gilded Lily. Arthur, the man in the black suit, stood silently beside her. He swiped a keycard, and the elevator surged upward, bypassing all 40 floors to open directly into the penthouse. The doors slid open with a whisper. Sarah stepped out onto plush white carpet. The penthouse was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. But despite the breathtaking view, the air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. It was quiet. Too quiet. In here, Arthur said, gesturing toward a set of double doors. Sarah walked through them into a massive dining room. Julian Thorne was sitting at the head of a long mahogany table. He looked worse than he had at the restaurant. His eyes were rimmed with red, his tie was undone, and he had the stubble of a man who hadn't slept in 2 days. Next to him, in the familiar wheelchair, was Leo. The boy looked pale, his skin almost translucent. A bowl of oatmeal sat untouched in front of him. A row of other rejected meals, pancakes, fruit, yogurt, sat on a sideboard nearby. He won't open his mouth, Julian said, not looking up as Sarah entered. His voice was a rasp of defeat. The doctors want to put in a feeding tube this afternoon if he doesn't eat. He's dehydrated. Sarah looked at Leo. The boy was slumped over, his eyes dull. But the moment he heard Sarah's footsteps, his head snapped up. A flicker of recognition lit up his green eyes. He let out a soft, bird-like sound. Julian looked up then, seeing Sarah. He stood up slowly. You came. I came for the check, Sarah said, her voice hard. She needed to protect herself. She couldn't let this billionaire hurt her again. And because your man said Leo was sick. He's not sick, Julian said, running a hand through his hair. He's on strike. He's stubborn, like his mother. He walked around the table, stopping a few feet from Sarah. The intensity of his presence was overwhelming. I owe you an apology, Julian said. It sounded like the words were foreign to him. I am not good with people. I manage systems. I manage data. When I saw you at the restaurant, I saw a solution. I saw the only person in 5 years who Leo responded to. So you fired me? Sarah asked, crossing her arms. I had to sever your contract with Vantage Group immediately so I could hire you, Julian explained, as if it were the most logical thing in the world. I didn't realize how it sounded until you ran out. I sent Arthur to find you, but you were off the grid. He took a step closer, his gray eyes pleading. Sarah, look at him. Sarah looked at Leo. The boy was reaching a trembling hand toward her. I have hired the best nannies in the world, Julian said. Nurses from Switzerland, specialists from New York. They all treat him like a patient. They treat him like a broken machine. You treated him like a boy. Julian reached into his jacket and pulled out a document. I want to hire you as his full-time caregiver. Live in. Sarah laughed, a short, bitter sound. I'm not a nurse. I'm a waitress. I don't have qualifications. I don't care about qualifications, Julian said fiercely. I care about results. The job pays $150,000 a year. Sarah stopped breathing. What? Plus benefits, Julian continued rapidly. Full medical, including coverage for dependents. I know about your mother, Sarah. I've already spoken to the head of nephrology at Seattle Grace. If you sign this, your mother gets moved to a private suite today. She gets the best care money can buy. Sarah felt the room spin. $150,000. Her mother saved. No more eviction. No more fear. What's the catch? Sarah whispered. The catch, Julian said, looking back at his son, is that you have to get him to eat that oatmeal. Right now. Sarah looked at the contract, then at Julian, and finally at Leo. She dropped her purse on the floor. She walked over to the table, pulled out the chair next to Leo, and sat down. The same way she had in the restaurant. Hey, Leo, she said softly, ignoring the billionaire watching her like a hawk. Remember me? Leo let out a happy squeal, his body relaxing instantly. Sarah picked up the spoon. Your dad says you're being tough. But I think you're just waiting for the right company, huh? She scooped up the oatmeal. Open wide! Julian held his breath. Leo opened his mouth. He took the bite. He swallowed. Then he tapped the table for more. Julian let out a breath that sounded like a sob. He slumped into his chair, covering his face with his hands. For the first time in days, the tension left his shoulders. Sarah fed Leo until the bowl was empty. Then she wiped his chin with a napkin, stood up, and turned to Julian. Where do I sign? 3 months had passed since Sarah moved into the guest wing of Thorn Tower, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The penthouse, once a silent mausoleum of glass and steel, now had life. Leo was thriving. Under Sarah's care, he had gained 10 pounds. His cheeks, once hollow, were round and rosy. But the biggest change was in his spirit. Sarah didn't just feed him, she engaged him. She realized quickly that Leo's physical limitations hid a sharp, curious mind. She read to him for hours. Harry Potter, Percy Jackson, stories about dragons and heroes. She found that while he couldn't speak clearly, he could communicate with a customized tablet she had convinced Julian to buy. Leo wasn't just a disabled son anymore. He was a boy who loved bad knock-knock jokes and hated broccoli. Sarah's mother, Martha, was doing well too. The treatments at the private hospital were working, and for the first time in years, she had color in her face. Sarah visited her every Sunday, her heart lighter than it had been in a decade. But the most subtle, dangerous change was happening to Julian. The billionaire, who used to spend 20 hours a day at the office, had started coming home at 6 p.m. He would find reasons to be in the living room while Sarah was doing physical therapy exercises with Leo. He would accidentally leave documents on the kitchen island so he could grab a coffee while Sarah was making dinner. One rainy Tuesday evening, Sarah was in the library with Leo. A fire was crackling in the hearth. Sarah was sitting on the rug, helping Leo build a tower out of magnetic blocks. Higher! Sarah laughed as Leo clumsily but determinedly placed a blue block on top. Careful! Careful! The tower wobbled and crashed. Leo burst into laughter. A deep, belly laugh that filled the room. Sarah looked up and saw Julian leaning against the doorframe. He had loosened his tie, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He was watching them with a look of such unguarded tenderness that Sarah felt a blush heat her neck. I haven't heard him laugh like that since he was a baby, Julian said softly, walking into the room. He has a great laugh, Sarah said, smiling. He thinks my structural engineering skills are hilarious. Julian sat down on the leather sofa near them. You have a gift, Sarah. You've brought this house back to life. It's just attention, Julian, Sarah said, using his first name. They had dropped the Mr. Thorne formalities weeks ago. He just needed to be seen. Julian looked at her. The air between them crackled with a sudden, undeniable electricity. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers as he picked up a fallen block. And what about you? Julian asked, his voice low. Are you happy here? Is it enough? Sarah looked into his steel gray eyes and saw the loneliness hidden there. She realized that Leo wasn't the only one who had been starving for kindness. I'm happy, she whispered. Julian leaned in closer. The distance between them closed. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. He smelled of rain and expensive scotch. Julian! A sharp, high-pitched female voice shattered the moment like glass. Sarah jerked back. Julian stiffened, his expression instantly closing off, returning to the stony mask of the CEO. Walking into the library was a woman who looked like she had stepped out of a Vogue cover shoot. She was tall, blonde, and impeccably dressed in a red designer dress that cost more than Sarah's entire life earnings. "Veronica," Julian said, standing up. "I didn't know you were coming over." Clearly. Veronica purred, her eyes darting to Sarah sitting on the floor in her jeans and t-shirt. Her gaze was dismissive, cold. "Since you weren't answering your phone, we have the Children's Hospital Gala this weekend, darling. We need to discuss the seating arrangements." Veronica walked over to Julian and placed a possessive hand on his chest, staking her claim. She looked down at Leo, her lip curling slightly in distaste. "Oh, and the boy is here," she said, as if Leo were a piece of furniture. "Hello, Leo." Leo shrank back, his smile vanishing. He made a low, growling sound, a sign of distress. "Sarah," Julian said, his voice suddenly businesslike again. "This is Veronica, my associate and fiancé." Sarah felt like she had been punched in the stomach. Fiancé? He had never mentioned a fiancé. "Nice to meet you," Sarah mumbled, standing up and brushing off her jeans. She felt foolish. A minute ago, she thought something was happening. But she was just the help. "You must be the new nanny," Veronica said, her smile not reaching her icy blue eyes. "Julian tells me you're adequate. Please take Leo to his room. Adults need to talk." Sarah saw the hurt in Leo's eyes. She saw the conflict in Julian's face. But he didn't stop Veronica. He didn't defend her. "Come on, Leo," Sarah said quietly. "Let's go get ready for bed." She wheeled Leo out of the room. As she closed the heavy oak doors, she heard Veronica's voice, sharp and cruel. "Really, Julian? She looks like a stray dog you picked up off the street. And allowing the boy on the Persian rug? It's unsanitary." Sarah pushed the wheelchair down the hall, her eyes stinging with tears. She had let her guard down. She had started to believe this was a home. But Veronica was a stark reminder of the reality. Julian was a billionaire king, and Sarah was just a peasant in his castle. But Sarah looked at Leo, who was looking up at her with worried eyes. She squeezed his hand. "Don't worry, Leo," she whispered, fiercely. "I'm not going anywhere. She might be the fiancé, but she doesn't know who she's messing with." The gala was in 2 days, and Sarah Jenkins wasn't going to let Veronica win without a fight. The Seattle Children's Hospital Gala was the event of the year. It was a sea of black ties, sequin gowns, and fake smiles, held in the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. Sarah stood in front of the full-length mirror in the guest wing, smoothing the fabric of her dress. It wasn't a designer gown. It was a simple, deep blue silk dress she had found on sale, but it fit her perfectly, matching the color of her eyes. She looked beautiful, but she felt like an imposter. "You look like a princess," a small, garbled voice said. Sarah spun around. Leo was sitting in his wheelchair, looking dashing in a custom-fitted miniature tuxedo. "And you," Sarah said, fighting back tears, "look like James Bond." Leo grinned, adjusting his bow tie with a hand that was much steadier than it had been 3 months ago. The door flew open. Veronica marched in, wearing a silver gown that looked like liquid mercury. She stopped, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Leo. "What is he doing dressed?" Veronica snapped. "He's going to the gala," Sarah said firmly. "It's a benefit for Children's Hospital. It makes sense for him to be there." "Absolutely not," Veronica hissed. "Julian is making the keynote speech. The press will be there. We cannot have Leo, twitching and drooling in the front row. It ruins the brand image. He stays here. You stay here. Julian asked us to come." Sarah lied. Julian hadn't explicitly asked, but he hadn't told them to stay either. "I don't care." Veronica stepped closer, her perfume overpowering the room. "I am the future, Mrs. Thorne, and my first rule is that this embarrassment of a child stays hidden. Take that tuxedo off him." Leo let out a whimper, shrinking into his chair. Something inside Sarah snapped. It was the same fire that had made her sit down at the restaurant table months ago. "No," Sarah said. Veronica blinked. Excuse me? I said no. Sarah stepped between Veronica and Leo. He is a human being. He is Julian's son. And he is going to that party. If you want to stop us, you'll have to drag us out. Veronica's face turned red. She raised her hand as if to slap Sarah. Ladies! Julian's voice was cold granite. He stood in the doorway, looking devastating in his tuxedo. He looked from Veronica's raised hand to Sarah's defiant stance, and finally to his terrified son. Julian. Veronica recovered instantly, dropping her hand and forcing a smile. I was just telling the nanny that Leo might be more comfortable at home. The lights, the noise. It might be too much for him. Julian looked at Leo. Do you want to go, buddy? Leo nodded vigorously. Yes, Dad. The word Dad was clear. It was the first time Leo had said it without stuttering in a year. Julian's eyes widened. He looked at Sarah, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. Then he goes, Julian said, offering his hand to Sarah. And so do you. The ballroom fell silent as the trio entered. Julian Thorne, the city's most eligible billionaire, walked in with his stunning fiancée on one arm, and a waitress pushing a wheelchair on the other. The whispers started immediately. Veronica held her head high, gripping Julian's arm so tight her nails dug in, but her eyes were darting daggers at Sarah. They were seated at the head table. Veronica made a show of ignoring Leo, turning her back to him to charm the mayor on her left. Sarah, meanwhile, sat right next to Leo, cutting his chicken into small bites and joking with him quietly. Then came the speeches. Julian walked up to the podium. The spotlight hit him. He looked out at the sea of wealthy donors. Tonight is about the future, Julian began, his voice commanding the room. It's about resilience. We give money to hospitals to fix bodies. But we often forget that healing requires more than medicine. It requires heart. He paused, looking down at the table. For a long time, I thought I could fix my life with money. I thought I could fix my son with doctors. He looked directly at Veronica. She smiled preeningly, thinking the speech was about to pivot to their engagement. But I was wrong, Julian continued. I was blind. I didn't see that what my son needed wasn't a check. He needed a champion. He needed someone who didn't see a wheelchair, but saw a boy. Julian took a deep breath. There is a woman here tonight who taught me that lesson. A woman who was fired from her job because she dared to show kindness to my son when I was too weak to do it myself. The room went deadly silent. Veronica's smile faltered. Sarah, Julian said, please stand up. Sarah froze. Her heart hammered. She slowly stood up. The spotlight swung over to her. She felt exposed, terrified. And Leo, Julian said, his voice cracking with emotion. Come up here, son. Sarah grabbed the handles of the wheelchair. Veronica shot out a hand, grabbing Sarah's wrist. Don't you dare. Veronica hissed under her breath. Sit down, you trash. Sarah looked at Veronica's hand, then at Julian on stage. She ripped her wrist free. She wheeled Leo up the ramp to the stage. The crowd erupted into polite but confused applause. Julian knelt down next to the wheelchair. He put a microphone in front of Leo. Leo has been working on a joke. Julian smiled. Go ahead, buddy. Leo looked at the crowd. He was shaking. The lights were bright. Sarah squeezed his shoulder. You got this, James Bond. Leo leaned into the mic. Why? Why did the cookie go to the doctor? The crowd held its breath. Because he felt crummy, Leo shouted. The silence lasted 1 second. Then the room exploded. Laughter, genuine and warm, filled the air. People stood up. It wasn't pity applause. It was joy. Leo beamed, his face lighting up like a supernova. Julian stood up, tears streaming down his face. He looked at Sarah. Sarah Jenkins changed my son's life, Julian said into the mic, and she changed mine. He turned to look at the table where Veronica sat, pale and furious. Veronica, Julian said, his voice hard, our engagement was a business merger, a joining of 2 companies. But I realized tonight, I don't want a merger. I want a family. Gasps rippled through the room. The engagement is off, Julian declared. You can keep the ring, but you will never, ever treat my son like a burden again. Veronica stood up, humiliated. She knocked over her wine glass, red liquid staining the white tablecloth, and stormed out of the ballroom, her heels clicking like gunshots. Julian turned back to Sarah. He turned off the microphone. "I know this is crazy," he whispered, oblivious to the 1,000 people watching. "I know I'm your boss. I know this is sudden. But when you left that restaurant 3 months ago, the light went out of my life. You brought it back." He took her hands. They were rough from years of carrying trays, calloused from hard work. He kissed them. "Sarah, I don't want you to be his nanny anymore." Sarah's breath hitched. "You're firing me again?" Julian laughed, a wet, happy sound. "No, I want you to be his mother. If you'll have us, I want you to be with me." Sarah looked at the billionaire who had learned to love, and the boy who had learned to laugh. She thought of her mom, safe and healthy in the hospital. She thought of the soup, the rain, and the journey. She looked at Julian. "Only if you promise never to fire me again," she quipped, tears spilling over. "Lifetime contract," Julian whispered. He kissed her. And as the crowd roared with applause, Leo laughed, clapping his hands, finally, truly, at home. Sarah went from a waitress on the brink of homelessness to the mother of a happy family. All because of one bowl of soup and a moment of kindness. It proves that no act of compassion, no matter how small, is ever wasted. You never know who is watching, and you never know how one decision can change your destiny. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button. It helps us share more stories like this. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Comment below. Have you ever done a random act of kindness? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.